This will be real quick. For those who don't know me, Eric Hunt, Extension Educator here at the University of Nebraska. Pleasure to have Dr. Bob Swap with us. Bob is the Associate Division Director for Earth Sciences, or I'm sorry, for Mission Planning for Earth Sciences at NASA Goddard. Prior to that, he was an award-winning professor at the University of Virginia. And for the next 45 minutes, Bob is going to do Bob things.
Thank you. Hold on, I'm going to change this. Can you guys hear me if I talk? Can they hear me online if I talk now? Can they hear me? Is that possible? Yeah. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, you guys got awesome weather. I'm sure it happens all the time. I'm glad to be able to sample that at this time of the year. Anyways, I'm here today, Bob Swap, and I'm here to share a few lessons learned from leading NASA Safari 2000. I'll walk through it. And I think it's important that you realize that there's subtext to it. When I hit the down button, the subtext to it. Hit the side button, subtext. I'm going to click on it and try to hold on. So I got to just figure out. Okay. Or in my case, examples of transdisciplinary, transboundary scientific cooperation. Why I think it was appropriate to talk to these kind of topics is that a lot of the work that you all do here, Nebraska, University of Nebraska systems, really spans boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, sectoral boundaries. And I just thought I'd share some lessons that I learned along the way and how it's helped inform my practice. Part of the purpose of doing this is that I feel it's something that I can share, especially for the 3 students in the room. Something's a little bit different than you would get normally in a class. And for me, my career has pretty much been about the process of inquiry. Some people could call that the scientific method, discovery. But basically, for me, it's always been about questioning, understanding, context, perspective, power, and connections. Okay, so I'm a physical scientist, but I realize that I don't do my physical science in a vacuum. It's in a context. So that's something that I've been really doing. The other thing that I realize is that it's about real world problems, transcending disciplinary boundaries. And that requires thinking outside the box. And thinking outside the box, of course, requires back to the point that you're talking about engagement and education, and something I heard from your dean, Tiffany. It's about education that serves a different purpose, all right? To be more complex, self-reflective. How do we take into account what our actions are, organic ways of thinking, how we pull in, how do we do transdisciplinary approaches, and that we bring in our stakeholders into the beginning of our thoughts, all right? And that we are educating for complexity, paradox, and unpredictability, right? And last time I checked, anything having to do with water, livelihoods in this part of the world, and weather, that's complexity, paradox, and unpredictability. So I just thought that. So a little bit about myself. So I've gone from literally being a fry cook to a nighttime manager, actually more like nighttime or daytime manager. I've been an on-the-ground field assistant. I've covered a lot of different things. So I've been in the trenches, been part of a team member. We were talking last night, Trent and I was the blocking dummy. He was the blocker kind of thing. But that allowed me to learn team dynamics, see team dynamics, be part of a team, realize how I can make a contribution and see where it needed to go. That led me to be able to be involved in things like being a principal investigator of a project, the U.S. principal investigator project of 250 scientists from 16 different countries. Okay, and what's interesting is I see several degrees of freedom removed, projects in Namibia, projects in South Africa. When I first started going to that part of the world in 1992, when I did my research, we weren't doing that. And I'll talk a little bit about how seeing these things spin off has really been fun. I went from being a rotator at headquarters, where I was a NASA, I was a US UVA employee, and I moved over and was on rotation, on loan, so to speak. And then I became civilized in 2017. So that's kind of my background. And I got eventually promoted because they needed something a little bit different. And I'm a little bit different. So from researcher to resource, because in order to be effective in these kind of roles, someone asked me today at lunch, you're an administrator, right? Kind of. But I think I have a little bit more credence with folks because of the role that I actually have done as being a scientist, all right? And gone through some health issues, things like that, multiple surgeries, 5 years out of circulation, but I still did all right in the publication, having influence. Some people may or may not be aware of the concept, Sahara Dust to Amazon Basin. That was my work from back in the day. I could have stayed in it, I could have melted, but I didn't. I moved on to other things. And you can see I've got a wide variety of experiences there. But what I think is most important is I only got here because I've been a beneficiary of the grace, hospitality, knowledge, patience, wisdom of others. And I say that because I'm coming from an East Coast context. There's a lot about me and not so much about we. And I kind of grew up with a little bit of background that said it is about we. Where does it come from? My imperative to conduct engaged scholarship. We talked a little bit about engaged scholarship, research and outreach. Where does it come from? Well, in my case, I've been influenced by my time in Africa. This kind of sums it up to me. I like team. And being offensive lineman, I was never going to score, but I could block and I could open up the holes for others to run and score and be successful. So I realized it's about working together. So if I wanted to walk far, I wanted to walk together. I didn't want to be the star. I wanted to work with others so that they could be the star. I already talked about the idea of real world problems transcending disciplinary boundaries. I say that because a lot of our work got pigeonholed. And as we've looked in the last 20, 25 years and the work that NASA has done to open up doors with the Earth observing system, we've realized the complexity of wicked problems. All right. So it's great to have the depth, but also we need people to connect and integrate. So for me, that was something I was curious about, how we could do the bigger things, how they're all connected. The other thing I realized in a lot of my practices is one size doesn't fit all. And what I mean by that is I'm not trying to craft a solution that could be ported around. I'm talking about crafting a process that might be able to be moved around, be ported around, that could be applied elsewhere in an intelligent fashion, in a culturally appropriate context. Okay. Now, in order to do that, I had to seek to understand before being understood. And it's a little bit hard. It's really hard because if you look at the way that we write proposals and the timelines that we have, we don't build in time to sit there and get to know each other, right? It's about hit it and quit it, get in, grab my data and get the hell out. Now, I don't know about you all, but that process doesn't work too well from where I'm from. And something tells me it probably doesn't work too well with some of the folks that you deal with as well. It's about being non-extractive in the process. The other thing is I realize, and I'm humble enough to realize that we all stand on someone else's shoulders. In my case, figuratively, literally would hurt. But the idea of how we could move in that direction. And I was also motivated because I really believe, as I said, from my conversations with Nebraska faculty the last 3 days, many of you believe that you want to be the change that you wish to see. You guys are doing this when you could be doing other things. Why? Because you believe in it. You believe in it and you want to make and affect change. So for me, it's about being about me, not me, but we. Okay. So wrap it up for that section. I'm a science diplomat because I had to engage with others. I'm a servant leader because I had to deliver. I'm a mentor. I'm a lifelong learner. One of the most important things for me is realize that I'm never going to be the smartest person in the room, and I'm okay with that. There's a certain humility that comes from that. And I think that allows me to connect and recognize other people's experts because they know something I don't. Now, let's go on to Africa, right? So I'm going to set the context. I know this state's large, right? And I just want to say, so why Africa? And I just want you to keep in mind how large this state is. Well, for me, what was really neat is I was into understanding change. So people like Kelly Kaler and company, we took over to Africa when he's a grad student and so on. Africa is the place where humankind, the environment, and fire co-evolve. So if I'm interested in any one of those aspects, why not go to the place where it started to see if I can understand it there rather than where it has morphed and changed? You know, patient zero in some cases, right? So for me, that was important to go back to where it was, because if I can't get it right here, it's not going to happen elsewhere. Now, position and size, and for the non-Africans in the room, what is unique about the African continent, geographically speaking? What are some unique qualities of it? Anyone? Anyone who's awake? Anyone who's breathing? Sits on the equator. How does it sit on the equator? Think about it. It's about half and half, literally. It's within a few degrees of it. So it's the only continent in the world that almost perfectly straddles the equator. By doing such, whatever happens in either the northern and southern hemisphere, it informs the rest of the planet. So if you want to pick a place to understand the impact on of change, that's the place to go. Now, what about size? Any of you all think about Africa like this, African continent like this? You know, that dude Mercator did more to change and stuff up the way we see the world than anyone realizes, okay? Take a look at that. I think we'd say vast tracts of land, right? Well, in order to drive this home, and why I bring this up, there's a lot of work I did. People didn't grasp this, something this simple. And they continue to express their ignorance whenever we went into the country or whenever they went to funding or whenever they talked to policy makers into the region, I should say. Now, for my folks, I had to put it in even starker terms. The two red dots and one red circle is the ring of repugnance known as, the region known as DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia. That's the Washington, DC, Southern Maryland, Northern Virginia. That little red dot is where I'm currently residing in Charlottesville, Virginia. All right. Over on the other side, equal projection done by Frank Eckhart from the University of Cape Town. That's just Southern Africa. Think about that. Kind of changes things. You know, I know Nebraska's big. Kind of get lost in there, right? Kind of get lost there. Now, why else am I interested in it? I'm interested because of rapid social ecological change. And this was done around the time of the World Cup. It's a land of juxtaposition, paradox. I think you go from subsistence to agriculture, whether it's manioc in the upper left, groundnuts, manioc, work in those areas. The rondavel, which is probably one of the human being's best engineering advances ever, to take locally sourced materials, build it in such a way that the thermal inertia works its way in and out of a dwelling such that it stays cool during the summer or during the day, and it stays warm at night. Very interesting. Addis Ababa, cutting edge, high-speed transition. But I want you to pay attention to this picture in the middle. Okay, y'all ever hear of the WSSD, World Summit on Sustainable Development? That happened in Johannesburg, South Africa. And it actually happened in a place that's called Midrand, not Midrand. It happened up here in Sandton City. See that tall building in the middle? That's where everybody flew in from around the world on their private jets and such. Now, you say, Bob, what's all this other stuff up front here? That is a township known as Alexandria. During the time of apartheid, the idea is you move people around, control their flow, control the labor markets, almost forced labor camps. And it was designed for 70,000 people. So over 700,000 people living in that place, okay? Now let me ask you this, if we're talking worldwide and we have people that are living in Sandton or meeting in Sandton talking about the plight of people who are living across the street 4 kilometers away, you start to see that disconnect between those who are making decisions and those who have to live with the decisions that are being made. And that was very important. Now, speaking of which, and decisions, I have to quote this because this is one of my first proposal reviews that came back. And I love this quote from a learned individual who reviewed my proposal. South African industry is an oxymoron. Okay, so let's just put that in perspective a little bit, shall we? Now, South Africa has 5 of the world's 10 largest coal-fired power plants. All right, and those are about 4,200 megawatts each in that area. Okay, put that in perspective. If you take a look at the Three Rivers Gorges before it built up, that was to produce 19,000 megawatts of power. So if China's building something to produce 19,000 megawatts, and I'm sitting here with 5 power plants that are producing over 20, you see the big deal. You see the way they handle pollution. The other thing you may or may not be aware of, the South Africans were world leaders in liquefaction of coal during the apartheid era. So how do you take coal, turn it into petroleum, create their own strategic reserves? They're also the only country that started the nuclear weapon program and just dismantled it. And they're also world leaders in deep mining, where they work at 5 kilometers below the surface. Think about that. The engineering that goes into working a stope, a rock face, a seam at 5 kilometers below the surface. Temperatures of rock face are over 160 degrees. How do you do that? All the engineering goes into it. So I want to go back to the idea of oxymorons. I know there's morons, just unaware. But for my case, I was really interested in biomass burning, the way people use the landscape. And it's an extensive biomass burning, which is a way of life. Put in this perspective, which is cheaper to operate? International Harvester Combine or a book of matches? Anyone? Yeah, you get the picture. So I got people in local areas that know what they're doing with fire as a tool, and they've been using it for millennia, right? And they burn to manage the landscape, and they do it to get the productivity, and they time the burning, and they time it according to the land. What you're looking at here is an ISS, International Space Station photo on the oblique, and I'm basically looking at an area that is equivalent to going from, say, Kentucky to Montana, and it's all smoke. Okay, all smoke. And as I show a little bit later, you'll see the size of it. But you say, Bob, what else? Well, why do we care about that? Well, you got to throw in the atmosphere a little bit, and we got to talk about climate change, if you will, or global climate change, or change in radiation balances. And there are 3 areas of semi-permanent stratocumulus clouds. Anybody been out to SoCal, Southern California in June? Sometimes they call it June gloom. The clouds come in. Those clouds that come in and give you that June gloom from the ocean, that's essentially stratocumulus cloud deck. You'll notice that these 3 areas in orange indicate the highest probabilities, as indicated by the arrows, indicate the highest probabilities of extensive cloud decks, okay? These clouds, the one off the west coast of the United States has been impacted by industry. The one that's off of South America is pretty much not anthropogenically impacted to a large extent because of the Andes. And then you have the one that's off of Africa, Southern Africa. And we were interested to see the changes in the rapid socioecological development and seeing how that might impact it, because any changes to these cloud decks can affect the planetary balance of radiation. This is what it looks like from space, okay? It's what it looks like from space. And just put this in perspective, you see Namibia, and I know you have people who've gone to Namibia, and we're not quite far enough. That's about twice the size of California that you're seeing there. These are large places, large places. So with that in mind, we cooked up something called the Southern African Regional Science Initiative. You'll see the number of flags there. You already heard about the number of people involved. But what we wanted to do is take a look at, use the region as a biogeophysical unit. And that region is, you already saw that picture when we compared it to the East Coast United States. And we wanted to take a look at aerosol and trace gas emissions that are derived from biogenic sources, as indicated by the plants, from pyrogenic sources, which you guys experienced this summer, biomass burning, and then also from industrial sources and how those things come together. And the focus, of course, was on, not of course, but the focus were the linkages between the observables and the processes that give rise to them, okay? And these include human impacts, biological processes, and how it changed the biophysical system. And what we did is we started to draw on all these different disciplines to pull together a multidimensional analysis of what was happening. And we were specifically targeted on regional aerosol trace gas transports and depositions, okay? Now, I should say we were doing this as part of validating and calibrating something called the Earth Observing System Terra platform. This was the first time that NASA had done this in a combined fashion, to pull this together to actually validate and calibrate these instruments simultaneously. We'll get to the size of that platform and the number of sensors on that platform, but suffice to say, large. Now the core experiment, I'm trying to look at I'm pointing at things, you guys can't tell what the hell I'm pointing at. And you still can't tell. What I was gonna say is that we have a combination of looking at clouds and aerosols, clouds and radiation, terrestrial ecology, aerosols, trace gases, integrated modeling, land cover land use change to go from emissions to impacts, looking at the feedbacks. And we leveraged everything that we could. We leveraged IGBP efforts known as the mega transects, which included Miambo, Kalahari. We also leveraged NASA's sizable investments in the US validation and other campaigns that we had. And why I think this is key is that it presented a model and a way to move forward in a collaborative sense to join together and leverage off of existing assets and take advantage of an asset-based approach. Now, the program approach was simple, okay? You can read, bottom-up science initiative. We started on the ground. We created a groundswell. We worked to get ourselves organized, shared situational awareness, and have the stuff bubble up. Participation was open to all, okay? However, it was BYOB. And what I meant by that is it wasn't for passive recipients, it's for active participants, and any form of capital was welcome, okay? And that capital could be human capital, intellectual capital, facilities, data, you know, and even the F word, finances, okay? So we also practice the no hit and run science. And I know this is important with the long-term relationships I heard from Dinner and a couple other folks having these long-term engagements. We try to avoid the parachuting in and out, okay? It was about being there for folks. We followed established international collaboration protocols that were agreed upon by folks and co-developed by them. And we developed a broader umbrella for regional research, something I've been trying to talk about while I was on this trip. Now, we incorporated the sentiments from the beginning, incorporated the sentiments of our regional partners. And what I think is important to realize is that they had a say in helping to shape this. They had the opportunity to influence where we were going. And for our regional partners, without fail, they said this had to have societal relevance. What you're studying had to have an impact or be relatable to the people on the ground. In our case, we really appreciate it if it could be policy relevant. Now, does this start to sound a little familiar to maybe some of the activities in the School of Natural Resources? I think it does, at least as I heard it. The other thing too, for folks that are from the continent, you got a lot of people want to run over and do capacity building. Okay, and they start off with capacity building. And capacity building in some ways implies that there's no capacity there, right? So one of the things we try to do is recognize the capabilities, the capacity, and assets in hand. Okay, and then the idea was to lay the foundation, to use this to lay the foundation for longer term monitoring. All right, so let's move forward. It was an asset-based approach, taking a look at that. We had open lines of communication. We worked on this idea of the Indaba, and the Indaba in Southern Africa is a process of consensus building. Anybody who's ever traveled around that part of the world, you get the village tree, and you'll notice it looks like there are chairs around the bottom of it. And it's not uncommon for people to get together. And the whole thing is when they would need to discuss or make decisions, the idea is that people come together, they get under the tree, the elders sit and listen to everybody, and they make sure that everybody who wanted to speak had the chance to speak. So at least they're heard. But it's not about democracy. It's about having the opportunity to be heard. That is taken in, it's factored into the decision making, and a decision is rendered. These things can last days because people get up there and they'll literally sit and wait for days to have the chance. We worked on developing a community of trust. And one of the things I really value about the University of Nebraska system and a lot of the work that I've heard you guys doing here, you guys walk the last mile. You interface with the people who pull on the data, who need this for their livelihoods and their lives, okay? You have that relationship. In that relationship, you have that trust. They're not expecting you to mess them over. And we had to do something similar here. So we had to work on building out our existing social capital and amplifying it. And of course, it wasn't like I hit the Powerball. So it was all about the ability to leverage and collaborate to get moved forward, okay? Now, regionality. Regionality is very difficult. I don't have to tell you guys that. You know the modern context. We won't have to get into it about shorter wavelengths versus longer wavelengths. We understand that. There's a lot of discussion going on. But in this part of the world, when I was working in it, they were fresh off of 30 some odd years of civil war. You literally had people fighting each other. They're now on the same science team. Okay? How do you work to build that trust? Well, one of the ways we built trust is we realized we had more to gain by coming together than by staying apart. So 1 + 1 did not equal 2, it was much greater than 2 because we could leverage the other networks that we had. And then we also realized that we were committed to ensuring that people had the opportunity to have the visibility to be recognized for what they're doing and leaving the legacy. Now, why did I put this up here? This stuff doesn't happen overnight, right? Anybody can go to a place once. It's a sign of respect. You've gone there, especially in the day of teams. But to go twice, to go 3 times, to go 4 times, to rotate around throughout your partners, where everybody has a chance to host and demonstrate what their capabilities are, to receive people. Culture is a big thing, right? For all of us, to be able to receive somebody, be hospitable, show them. All these meetings, they started back in 1993 with some of the first ones, but it really caught fire, no pun intended, in 1999 to move forward. So I want you to pay attention to all these things that we did here and moving it around. And it was in the US, and it was in the region. And we went all over the place. Another thing that we did, because you all do this well, education and community outreach. NASA invested millions of dollars to take what it is that they do out into the areas, out into townships, into the schools. It's really cool because some of those young people that we actually met in the townships 15 years later got their degrees and they're actually pursuing this. Okay, they're actually pursuing it. They fought hard based on what they saw. What I'm presenting here is a picture. We actually had an open day, open house at the site that it was operating out of in Polokwane. That is the Convair 580. Anybody's ever done meteorology? Peter Hobbs, Wallace and Hobbs, that book. That's Peter Hobbs' aircraft. We had 10,000 people go through, starting at 7 a.m. and finishing at 7 p.m. And we were there to meet every one of them that wanted to ask a question. And again, people who stood that line ended up pursuing their degrees. So let's talk a little bit about the structure and our approach to it. Because you say, okay, Bob, how we do it? We talked a little bit about nesting. I think, John, we talked a little bit about nesting approaches and understandings. And I talked to Craig yesterday about anarchy and interacting scales of involvement. Well, one of the things we did is we went from nose height to satellite, okay? And what we did is we leveraged off of ground-based opportunities, whether it was prescribed fires, was CMELs and Aeronet, or whether or not it was ground-based aerosol sampling. We flew in situ aircraft that are the two lower ones. This was a South African one. They had two from the South African Weather Bureau. This was the University of Washington. And here's the ER2 that's still flying. We have two ER2s at NASA. And that ER2 flies at 65,000 feet, carries a payload of, you know how many hundreds of pounds, 1,000 pounds plus. And it flies airborne simulators of satellite instruments. And the idea was that we line these up with each other such that we got the timing when that satellite passed over the top of us, okay, to take its observations. Now, that satellite, that platform, that's what it looked like, okay? It was the size of a school bus. Size of a school bus. 9 different instruments that were involved as part of it, okay? Size of a school bus. That is the heyday of Earth observing system, okay? That's Terra. That forever changed the way that humankind saw this planet. That was NASA. That's you guys paying taxes. This is what happens. And those data were made freely available. Forever changed the way we looked at it. That was in 2000. Where are we today? Big question. Well, back to data. How do we anchor these things? And why I'm talking to people like this? Well, the one way we anchored it is that we built out nesting on the ground, understanding point to pixel, or in a case like Kelly used to do, individual trees to stands, to plot or plots to stands and so on, how we took that understanding. And we nested with different types of observations, whether it was Iconos imagery, Miser imagery, which had finer resolution, Aster imagery, which was there, and then we used those as anchor points. Then, since we had those anchor points, we overflew them with our ER2 aircraft, okay? Now, 120 hours of flying satellite simulators over this landscape, over anchor points, gave us plenty of opportunity to be able to test drive the relationships and algorithms that we were using to actually apply them to the rest of the world. And remember the size of this? Operating out of space, and you take a look at how far we flew and where we flew. And I think you'll notice something a little bit different here, a little bit strange. Notice where that red X, that red question mark is? That's Zimbabwe. We invited in Zimbabwe. We had Zimbabweans on a mission, but we had a overzealous postdoc. You ever heard the expression loose lips sink ships? Well, this guy started talking about, oh, NASA's going to fly its spy plane over the top of you. And at this point, Mugabe and the gentleman I was talking with, Zinuera, there was a lot of sensitivity. Sound familiar? You got sensitive communities you might be dealing with. You don't trust the government or anything. Well, in this site, the guy was wary of us because he thought we were going to spy. And then the overzealous postdoc said, well, even if you don't let us fly, it doesn't matter. We'll just use our satellites to figure out what you're doing. Dead on arrival. We were done. We were toast. We still engaged our partners on the ground, but we could not legitimately fly because we had no permission to do that. So I just show that. That's an example where communication, miscommunication, poor messaging can hurt you. Now, What was some of the stuff that we were after? We were after biomass burning plumes, and you guys are no strangers to biomass burning plumes as they come down from Canada. They didn't bring Tim Hortons with them, though. That's the problem. To put this in perspective, the width of the smoke plume, this is literally from Orlando to Maine. Now imagine that, Orlando to Maine. And actually, you had to fly instrument rules on this. And I was on this day when I flew over Lake Kariba, which you can see there. But I can tell you, we didn't know if we were up or right side down without the instruments. This also happens to be the place, when you took a look at some of our products, this was the most impacted area in terms of aerosols in the world. And it was for much of the region. And there were big fires that were going on around us. But what this did is it started to allow us to develop an understanding that moved on. And we call that phenomena the river of smoke. We produced plenty of papers on it. Well, I want to talk about quickly what were the outputs. And I'm not going to give you, we found out this, we did that, and the other thing, because it's large. But I want to talk to you about how these activities can lay the way, the framework for bigger things. So it's well in excess of 200 papers, closer to 300 some odd papers that resulted from this. There's more than 25 PhDs that came out of it, including about 10 that were regional. The thing I'm most proud about is that the first results that were published in a regional journal. We didn't try to scoop anybody. We wanted to honor the support of the region. And we went to the South African Journal of Science and we put first light results in there. Okay. We put it everywhere. But we also have another problem that some of you all might deal with. And that was, how do you get the data in people's hands? And I know for some people today, that seems ridiculous with 5G and everything else. But 20 years ago, the only way that people could get their hands on data was through CD-ROM data sets. And we published thousands of these things. And we hand delivered thousands of these things. All right. And we had 3 days. You could still pull this off the web at ORNL DAC. We also left originals of our RC10 cameras. Now, an RC10 camera is the spy camera. It's about just over a foot in diameter in terms of the lens, the focal lens of the camera. And we photographed what they wanted to photograph and left the originals there. We took copies. They have the originals. They're all in the region. And you can zoom down these things. You can literally get down to the scale of a foot or two from space. What else did we do in terms of data? Well, you guys use a lot of Landsat, right? Back in the day, Landsat cost. It cost money. And back when we did this, we pushed the system to come up with Landsat scenes. And the scheme was, if someone paid for the first image, then it would only cost to pay for the media to get the second image, right? So NASA invested, tiled the whole region, published this, purchased this, and got it out into their hands. And some of the areas that you guys like to go and visit, I was talking to one young woman who went out there, George, yeah, you've been there. Larkin, Okabanga Delta, Mongu River Basin, but we painted that. We also bought proprietary information that we got permission to share and leave behind. We also worked hard on taking our science to inform policy. And we worked with NGO partners because we're government entities and we participated in regional science dialogues. And we took that information and communicated it with decision makers and ministers. Came together and it was a different way of communicating. I didn't say we dumbed things down, but we made them accessible, okay? So that was the approach that we had done. Now, what else did we contribute to? They developed some networks that some of you might be aware of, SAFNet, the Southern African Fire Network, where they continue with fire validation, ELTOSA, Environmental Long-Term Observation of Southern Africa, APINA, SEON, which is kind of like our neon on the ground, and one of the most unfortunate acronyms, I would say, in my mind, African Association of Remote Sensing Environment. So the other thing I did, though, is I realized I'm a professor, I'm at a university, we've just invested over $30 million from all these different countries doing things. What happens when we leave? What happens when we leave? That's when a number of other researchers got together and said, is it possible to create a regional knowledge network? And we worked to establish that, realizing that different players had different strengths, that if we mosaic them and got cross-chat, cross-talk, that we could actually come together and create a regional knowledge network, which we did. What did that result in? That resulted in our ability to grow our own timber, the next generation of decision makers. What I'm showing you here, some of these young people from Rwanda, Mozambique, one of my former grad students, together with a gentleman from Brussels, Michel Verstraete. We have Antonio Kitfasi here in the middle. He was one of the people who was actually doing his PhD during this program. Over here is Joseph Kanyanga from Zambia, involved with UNFCCC. And then we had UNEP over here with Julian Kambani. We worked with people to meet them where they were, to help them realize and provide the resources to get where they wanted to be. More importantly, though, we inspired generations of young people. I was involved with creating this. We had a course we created called Ethics, Protocols, and Practices of International Research, or How Not to Screw Up International Relations. All right, that was a January term intensive, so 14 days. We brought our colleagues in from around the world. Those are the pictures of people standing. And then we also went to study abroad. Anybody see Black Panther? If you look at the CGI and you remove it, this is the view. But he was sitting there talking to his girlfriend up on the bluff and that. This was a view, and they filled it in with some CGI. What was neat about this summer study abroad is we had a ratio of 75% US-based students and 25% regionally based students. And I built it into the cost structure that their participation could go in there. So we continue to build the relationship and the networks and have folks move to the next generation. These are examples. That went on for 13 years. But you're like, hey, Bob, what about the good, the bad, the ugly? Come on, Clint Eastwood, where is he? Come on, talk to me. Come on, you're gonna give me that, it's a long day. So the good, okay? What did Safari 2000 do well? Well, Legacy Safari 2000, as you can see, we established community of trust, all sorts of spinoffs and things like that. The bad, we did a lot of good, but the bad, we had to negotiate tough situations while we're in the field. Poor communication. I already told you about Zimbabwe. We also had a little unfortunate situation where someone set a prescribed fire right next to a military base without talking to anybody. And that resulted in us being kicked out of the country. And I was actually being held at gunpoint when that happened. Because remember that flight I took and I said I flew over Zimbabwe. I couldn't see Lake Kariba. It was terrible. I landed on the ground wearing my gnarly dog surf shirt, you know, and my shorts and smelling like a goat. I get off the plane and I'm greeted by an officer and 4 soldiers carrying automatic weapons. And they said, sir, please come with us. And I was held there for 3 days as we tried to figure out the snafu because we did not have the lines of communication in place. And it was further exacerbated because we had some shenanigans by some of our civil servants in the US, which caused the ambassador to send some of us home. But Bob, what about the ugly? Now, I'm glad you have One Health. Glad to see how One Health is working. But in my case, my scenario, I don't know how it is here. I'm sure it's different. The doctors seem to know everything. As they would call them in the local language, docatelas. The docatelas always came in telling you what was wrong with you. Not asking me to say what's wrong with you. And somebody who went through a bunch of surgeries, I know I resent it when someone walked in holding their golf grip saying, you need a 5-level fusion. All right. I knew how they felt. Well, in our case, we had people who were actually selling this concept in the northern regions of South Africa, that 30% of the population was having diarrheal diseases and dying of it on an annual basis. Now, I'm not bright, but 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. After 3 years, we shouldn't have too many people around. And I kept trying to say, they're not dying of diarrhea. They're dying because of a lack of water. People know how to treat water. They need water. So what came up was one of the quotes of the century for me. This is a nice little piece here, encountering developers in the field. And the local folks said, look, we do not die of too much defecation, right? It's the lack of water. But the doctors put it in people's heads, they fundraised off of it, and they pushed it through, and they tapped people who cut big checks, and basically it was not a very good engagement with the locals, which I'll go through. So some lessons learned about it. Come down the home stretch. Well, for me, it's about TIA. Okay, TIA. And I'm not talking about this TIA. Anybody saw Blood Diamond? It was a terrible movie, but you know, his accent was terrible for a South African. But it wasn't that TIA. I'm talking about this TIA. Transparency, integrity, and accountability. Say what you mean what you say, do what you promise, don't oversell. So that was a big step that we learned, because you're only as good as your word. And part of that was really necessary for folks to work on the management of expectations up front. What's going on here? What can you do? What can't we do? And in my case, and you see me, I get a little bit fired up sometimes. I feel pretty comfortable with what I can and can't do based past experiences. It's not just managing the expectations of those with whom I engage, but also myself. I have to check myself. Okay. So that was a big deal that I had learned along the way. And by the way, I didn't learn this in graduate school. It wasn't a course on checking your expectations. The other thing that came up was a different understandings of what needs means. And I had this explained to me by a medical worker, Bushbuck Ridge. She said, Bob, there are three. We understand it in three general terms. We have perceived needs, where someone from the outside says, you know what you need? Then we have people who have a solution already and say, you're going to get this solution, whether you like it or not. Okay. And then you have the third kind of needs, which have to do with the express needs of the community, which by and large are not, and I think, Larkin, you know this, it's only when you sat down, you took patience and you engaged with people that they really opened up to you and shared. If they felt like you weren't there or not present, this stuff stayed hidden. I suspect it's the same if people who live here, anything like my relatives in Missouri, they want to see if you're serious. So one of the other things I learned is that if it pays, it stays. If it has value, it will remain. Part of that is a joint venture. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is taking integral accounting. And what I mean in terms of integral accounting is to take stock of what assets you have in hand. How many have fallen into the trap of, I don't have this? Man, I don't have this. I don't have this. We focus so much on what we don't have that we forget about all the wonderful stuff. All this you just told me is like, man, I had 10 years of this stuff. But we focus in on the here and now, what we don't have, rather than taking a look at what we do. Anybody ever see Apollo 13? All right, remember he used to have a problem, Gary Sinise, sinus infection. Not like my friend now. Remember when they came to solve the problem, NASA brought all these people, they brought all this stuff to sit there and fix the capsule. And Sinise in that scene said, no, stop. The solution to the problem lies within the capsule because that's all they have. We have to get creative to take a look at the assets that we have in hand and reconfigure them to deliver a solution. So it was a different approach. Anyways, now, the other thing, back to words, you think about the capital of a system, right? And you can think of it, and we often get caught up, if you think of it as an equation, well, sure, the first term is probably the largest term, but the residuals are also important, right? In terms of the different forms of capital that we have. All right. So human, intellectual, cultural, and so on. You can read it. But why is it we get stuck on the F? Why do we let the F word trip us up? Not realizing we've got the hardest part, in many cases, already covered. And again, that goes back to the deficit-based mindset. I don't have these things, not realizing I have all these other things. And it's something we often don't take into account when we do that. Now, quickly, I think of it as CPR. And I try to incorporate these concepts into when I was teaching development studies and international engagement and even research projects. CPR, the 5 C's, 3 P's, 3 R's. 5 C's, you see them: curiosity, culture, context, connection, civic engagement, co-construction. We often forget about the C part. Why is that important? If you sit there, I'm going back to pies last night, dessert was great. So if I go back and think of all knowledge, human knowledge is almost like a pie. It doesn't happen probably here too much, but it happens a lot on the East Coast. We tend to think that the academy is responsible for the vast majority of the content of that pie. 60, 70, maybe even more. But you know what's interesting? There's a significant fraction that lies outside of the academy. And you know what's funny? If we don't get curious about that and don't incorporate it, that may be the solution to our challenge. All right. And our arrogance can kind of get in the way of us sometimes because we don't do it. So basically, one way to view an event, perhaps, from different perspectives. But we all have some validity and some degree of validity in how we see the problem. The question is, how can we capture that? So we have much to learn from each other. Now, this I found interesting, and this is what my community started to share with me. See if any of this sounds familiar. We were fine until you came along and told us we weren't, right? We're going to save you, not realizing they're alive, they're functioning, they're having kids, they're growing up, they're doing things, but we're going to save them. 2, you get to go home when you're finished. I got to live with whatever the hell you just did to me, right? And then 3rd, it feels as if you outsiders want us to stand still so you can do good to us. And I had people who got to know me that well that they laid it out. Now, what's important, and I actually had to share it from an elder from the Chickahominy tribe just a few months ago. He goes, Bob, you know what we learned? If we're not at the table when these things are being drawn up, we end up on the menu. Think about that. So we're putting together these kind of arrangements, this kind of interaction, and this type of engagement with the people downstream. Getting people in the room can go a long way to whether or not you're successful. So, as I was saying, please remember, no matter how well-intentioned, we're not here to inflict anything. So the 3 Ps, real quick. People, process, product, rather than product, process, people. And I say this because I fought with my engineering students all the time because they wanted a rubric and they wanted a metric and they wanted the first 3 minutes of class, and they tuned out because they were already working on a solution without paying attention. Okay, so this notion is putting people first, getting our people oriented. Remember, you want to walk far, walk together, but anybody's ever walked through a shopping mall with little kids knows it can be challenging and take some time. Okay, so that's what I was trying to get folks to focus on, and I learned. And then this is all in the foundational tenets of the 3 R's: respect, reciprocity, relationship. And the goal is to move towards the transformative rather than the extractive. So that's what we're trying to do. So I also learned it was about humility rather than hubris. I think see, I'm giving this, talking to you guys, you all are kind of chill, right? You know, don't get too full of yourself. You survived Princeton, right? You came back all right. But you know, on the East Coast and the Ivies, some folks start to think a little bit, you know, they get a little big in the britches about what they think and what they know and how important they are without talking to other people. And that can lead to problems. Trust, another lesson I learned. You have to earn it over time. It can't be bought and it cannot be compressed. And again, going back to the funding situation, they don't build that into grants to take time to build relations. That's an externalized cost that's often borne by the institution or individuals. That's blood, sweat, and equity. I also learned about ethics in terms of doing no harm from a medical perspective, but I think it's also incumbent upon us to have enough situational awareness to know what harm could be, to study ahead, to know what harm could be. So it's incumbent upon us to do no harm. All right, so we know that, we know that these are challenges, asymmetries in capital. We already know, we've talked about these kind of things, and we can acknowledge it. We can acknowledge biases, the asymmetries, be up and open about it. This happens, we know it, we're out in the open. We realize that power dynamics are driven. In the case of Southern Africa, you have big brothers, big siblings from the north and south coming down, but you also had big siblings in the south telling other countries what to do when you were just at war with them not less than 5 years ago. So, as I move forward here, and we already talked about the understanding of needs, I want you to ponder a few questions and move forward. Okay. And this is weird because you're like, well, I just do this kind of science. Why does this matter? Because every kind of science we do, we're getting money from somebody. And as soon as we take money, that becomes political. And politics involves other human beings, which means there are other agendas at play. And these are the hard skills. This is the human engineering, the social engineering that goes into how do we pull off these projects. I know many in this room are much better than I, community engagement and working with folks and navigating these difficulties. So how do we contribute to building communities of trust, communities of practice? How do we do that? How do we pull people together? You know, what's your approach individually? How do you think about through time? And I know for the students, We had some interesting questions back and forth. How do you navigate these things? How do you build community at different points in your career? Whose equity counts in the process? By virtue of me going to a location, I've already demonstrated to those people that they've got something I want. You know why? If they didn't, I wouldn't be there. So how do I negotiate that? How do I navigate that? All right. Whose equity counts in the decision-making process? How do we develop alignment? I told you this was a bottom-up effort. Well, bottom-up will only get you so far. You need a combination. Top-down often is like this. Bottom-up, you're like struggling. You need to meet in the middle. How do we do? How do we get the vertical alignment? Okay. And now that you're aware of this, and you've been aware, and you've had these experiences, can you ever go back to being unaware? Can you ever go back to practice since having been exposed to them? And then finally, if not you, then who? So I conclude by saying, how do you want to walk? You want to walk fast, or do you want to walk far? And that's something for all of us to ponder. And on a given day, sometimes I want to run fast away from things. So with that, I thank you. And I'll put up some, you can reach me here. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can, X, we had the discussion about X. I don't know why I still put my handle up there. If anybody wants to do it. And then ResearchGate and so on. And here's some examples of some of the things that we've done in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I got plenty of other references if you all want to see it. But I'm open to take any questions if anybody has it. And with that, I want to thank you for your time because I know it's not an easy slot to speak in. So thank you. All right, I'm told I have to give the microphone over. Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, for this interesting and very important presentation. My question is, I have a couple of questions. One is, this kind of a project over the Southern African countries.
Mhm.
So, what's the update now? I think you started early in the 90s and then the early 2000, and you mentioned up to 2014. And so what's the update?
So what's happening now? As we currently speak, there is an effort that's underway called Bioscape. It's focused on hyperspectral remote sensing biodiversity effort that's there. We had subsequent efforts. We had the Kalahari Transect. We had a number of people go back on both NASA and NSF funding to work the Kalahari Transect. We had a number of people go to Namibia and they worked in the Namib Desert. We hosted and we went back and forth in terms of helping students and postdocs going back and forth. And that regional science, that regional knowledge network, that went on for more than 12 years, 14 years. And we exchanged during that time more than 450 students using non-governmental funds. So that's going on. Now, we have invitations to go back. We have a proposal out there. We are looking to go back to Southern Africa to work on drylands. That's one thing we want to try to do. But things have gotten tricky sometimes politically on an international front. So we had to take a little bit of a back step. But you ask good questions. There's work going on in Ethiopia and the Horn. There's work that's gone on subsequently in the equatorial regions of Africa and the continent.
Yeah, that was my second question.
Yeah.
So are you going to scale it up and expand to Eastern Africa?
So AMA went on. That was the Amazon, the African Monsoon project. That was in the western part of Africa. We've had people go back and forth using AfriSAR, and the SAR observations were over the Congo and other regions. That has gone on. In many ways, we've gone to RC, and we presented at RC, hosted. We also got IGARs to go down there in that part of the world. So we've worked together to do that. Is there a plan to go forward? It's open. But the thing is, it isn't just for us to go, it's a push-pull. As you know, you can push all you want into a community here, but there's no pull, you know, so it's open. I can tell you, I got a lot of Ethiopians, including Belay Damaz, working with us from UMBC, and we're constantly trying to figure out how to get back there. But that's a great question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Other questions?
No? No.
Thanks, Bob. So Kevin and I were kind of joking here that we decided we'd like to go far, but we'd like to get there quickly. in answer to your final question. But to put that into like an agency standpoint, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how you, so I mean, at the university, yeah, there's big picture we have these grand challenge grants and things, but there's also kind of short time fuses on P&T decisions and all this stuff that comes along, and so there is. I just wondered how you navigated kind of this what was it, 13-year, 15-year project? I mean, a long multi-year project, and how do you kind of keep the people that are providing the funds happy along the way and convinced that
candy, man. Eye candy. So Larkin, as you're embarking on your new position, you too can learn the subtle art of begging. So no, all kidding aside, it was developing relationships, and we found a couple of key alums, and we found some non-alums, but friends of the university, and we found people who weren't even part of the university who liked what we were doing. And we would get little pots of money that gave us some of the green money to allow us to do things. And then we would go after smaller NSF grants, some STEM grants, and then we went after internal IRAD or research and development type monies. And what we had to do was demonstrate, hey, we've already got this amount of money that's sunk. We've got these kind of networks that are already established. We already have this value in place. For every dollar you give us here, you can leverage X amount of dollars there. And I tried to hustle that way. The other thing, I actually had former students start to get $500 or $1,000 to sponsor kids going back and forth. And it was the exchange of the young people who had the energy. They went out. They took this forward. It's kind of like we lit fire to them and off they ran. Now, NASA moved on to other things, kind of real big and slogging around and going to different areas. But NSF came in behind, gave us money. We had Department of State came and gave us some money. We actually were able to use some of the NASA monies to help build out global networks with our colleagues in different regions. So if we want to go to the Horn, we start getting some of the instruments out there. We start establishing anchor points, which make it logical for the next opportunity. So what we thought of and how we see it is that we're working on building a cathedral, if you will. We didn't care. We needed bricks. We didn't care if there were small bricks, big bricks, government bricks, private bricks. We needed bricks. And whatever came in, all money was good money. And what we tried to do was pull together. We also worked really hard on social messaging, coverage, feel good. We went to the Kiwanis and Rotary Club that gave us money. We went all over the place that we could. And much of my time, my publication record fell off because I had to take a new role, which was going out there and kind of leading the way and blocking and fighting the resources we needed. I'm not lying, it's not easy, but we had some people come to us based on our approach, our ethos, our integrity, and that was enough to carry us forward. I raised probably $2.5 million of private money over the years, and then I supplemented that with about another $500,000 to $750,000 elsewhere. And when the students went abroad, I built into the price structure for an extra, $400 or $500 for their cost. That also got our partner students involved. So we kept it alive by keeping the energy going back and forth between being ready, being positioned. So when opportunity did present itself, boom, we could go. Thank you. Other questions? Anyone?
Others?
Yeah, thanks for your talk. And I was curious, you're talking a lot about very personal interactions, a lot of effort at that level. But you're also talking about, we were talking earlier about open science, and I was wondering what your vision for open science is, and as opposed to this, very personal effort, do you see them as part of the same thing? Do you see them, how can we accomplish this, or can we accomplish this without that very hard effort, which takes time and people? That's just the gist of my question, I guess. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
So I kind of glossed over it. If not you, then who? And every time you meet somebody, you have an opportunity. You're an ambassador of what you do, of your country, or where you're from, your discipline, or whatever. And these are small acts. Remember the small bricks? So I viewed it was incumbent on me to whoever I met to engage. The other thing is I realized I had to be a good citizen of the institution I was in. And it became personal for me because I had actually had people who I respected in the field, and I thought they were out to help me and help me grow and all that. And it was really interesting where I do all the hard work. It's like I went shopping and cooked the meal, and I was setting the table and laying it all up, and I'm getting ready to eat, and I'm like, get the hell out of here. It's my turn. Okay. That sticks with me. In open science, we got to make sure it's not extractive practice. It sounds good, but is it just a front for us to go and pull and extract? Or is it truly an opportunity to do something truly transformative? So I'm in my heart of hearts, where I am in this position, for better or worse, and they were stupid enough to let me get past 5 years, so it's hard to fire me now because I'm a federal employee for 5 years. I'm going to fight for that because I think that's what we're supposed to do with our, it's not about feathering my nest. It's about what do I do as someone who represents the agency and part of the US government with taxpayer dollars to get the most effective return on that investment. And I'm going to fight till my last breath in that organization to hold people accountable. It's not our private playground. I raise this because there are people who are licking their chops. I can't wait. Open science, come to me. We're guarding against that, myself and a number of others. It sounds altruistic. It sounds kind of like, you know, Haley Mills in one of those movies with Pollyanna or whatever. But for those that are old enough to remember Haley Mills, but that's what I'm trying to do. And I have to set an example. If I want that to happen, I have to model that to the next generation. I can't do this and not do this. And you all know what's fake, right? I was talking to you lunch. You know what's fake. So how do I do this to get to open science? I start in the classroom. I start with people I meet. I start with the way I conduct my business. And for me, a sign of success, regardless of what I do, is I always have an open invitation return to where I've been. How many people can actually say that domestically, not including internationally? So that's how I approach it. That's how I try to model it. Because I grew up with the axiom of monkey see, monkey do. Here's a monkey, you're watching me do it, and hopefully you can do the same thing. So that's what I try to do. I don't know if that's going to work. And by the way, if you see something, you got to say something. How many of you guys go to meetings and sit back when you could be asking a question? Excuse me, point of clarification here. Can you help me understand? Did I just hear you correctly? I'm a little bit confused. We have to ask those hard, clarifying questions. If we do not hear it, we have to speak up. Remember, we're in a room that others may not be in. That's part of open science. What do our constituents look like? What are their needs? So that's how I try to do it. I don't know if it works or not. We'll see. A couple more years, I might be. Yeah, I'm trying to find that Amway application that I had. But anyways, I just have to have that in my back pocket. But that's what I'm doing. And I'm not going to let them get away with it. Other question? It is personal. I take it personally. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, sir.
Bob, I really appreciate that. I heard lots of concepts related to adaptive challenges and adaptive leadership in your presentation. An area that I was exposed to much later in life, and pondering and wondering what insights you might have on what are prerequisites and how do we think about next generation and conveying those things. What has to happen for them to be ready to feel it in the heart as opposed to think about it in the head?
Thank you. That's a great question. I grew up in a military family. We were Navy. So we had a lot of Marines around us. I kept hearing a phrase when I was growing up, something about embracing something. I won't repeat it, but I'm trying to get students in this day and age where everything's been mapped out and they're expecting almost breadcrumb trail of how to get through life, paint by numbers experience. That's the biggest disservice we could do. So back to how do I handle it? Give an opportunity to fail safely is what I try to put in the classroom. I'd much rather have people fail when the stakes are low and they learn the most important thing, which is to embrace this uncertainty and deal with the most difficult question in life. Now what? Now what? That's a hard question. So if somebody screwed up a lot of times, I had an ample opportunity to embrace that. You're alive until you're not. If you're sincere, you operate transparency, integrity, and accountability, you're going to learn along the way. Not starting a lot, being on the bench. I watched people's actions. I didn't judge them. I just watched. If you do this, you get that. So I use that to inform. And I try to give students the opportunity to have some leadership experiences at a very early age. They don't have to be perfect, but the more exposure they can get to that earlier, take that with them as they grow forward. That's what I try to do. How I was fortunate, my advisor, this is what he said. I've got a job. My job is to ensure that you get a job. And I'll do whatever it takes, and you just stand on my shoulders to get there. Okay? So I try to live that. And I thought that's the way that mentors work. I kind of learned differently when I went to do my postdoc. That's what I try to bring. The background, I've been raised by two Midwestern parents. You know, I was instilled with certain values. And I carry those values with me. And I may be a riser, but I'm not a climber. And you know the difference, right? And that's hard for students because they want to make it all about product and they forget about the journey along the way. They forget about the fact of living. I try to tell my students back to leadership. I approach it as life is a great big plate of gravy. I'm a great big fluffy biscuit. And my job is to sop up as much gravy as possible before that plate's taken away. I mean, dude, I've screwed up in so many different ways. Anyways, thank you for that question. That's a good one. Anybody else? No? Great. Like, when the hell are we finished? All right, I see that look. But thank you guys again for doing that. Thanks for sitting it through. Thanks, students. The two of the